like.
Yeah. So we'll see now if we can get some, yeah. Well, this is a nice, bright, sunshiny day, and it happens to be the 23rd day of February in 1965.
Oh, it does.
Or is it the 22nd?
It's the 22nd.
That's the 22nd. And I was thinking, I don't know why I should think the 23rd, Dr. Everett.
You had a reason.
Must have. Must have been that cherry pie I had yesterday. Because my boy wanted some cherry pie. And his
Well,
mother
I
made
noticed
sure.
one thing about this 22nd, also about Lincoln's birthday, that they don't seem to observe it very much today.
Don't you think that's an area type of thing? For some
Well,
reason or another?
I just don't know.
I've noticed it more in the north and the east, that there's more of an observance. Not that they're any more patriotic. I don't mean it that way. It just happens
Well,
to
I
be.
mean they're observing here less than they used to here.
Maybe it's general.
That's what I meant.
Well, we're in what building are we in here at 815 Northeast 13th?
This is the School of Medicine building, so-called.
And the administrative building, is it?
Yes, it's that, and it's also some classrooms and that, you know, and professors. And the library is there.
We might say it's fairly well crowded.
Oh, yes. Everything's crowded here.
Dr. Everett, as you
It's Everett.
probably... Everett.
Yes.
How do you spell it?
E-V-E-R-E-T-T.
E-V-E-R-E-T-T. And
Yeah.
your initials?
M-R, Mark
M-R.
R.
Well, the reason I wanted to
I have a son, so the R is important.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to make sure that we got this on the tape, since it is a portion of the Living Legend Library, and correct any misapprehensions or ideas that other people might not have, since it will be a matter of record and used by students, historians, workshops, and so forth as they refer to it from here on in, because they not only will want to know some of the activities of Dr. Everett, but also, well, what's he sound like?
Well, they'll probably want to know something about Oklahoma.
That's right. And what you did. Where did you come from, Doctor?
Well, my home was in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania German district there, east part.
And you came, or your family came, or what was the...
No, we're a family from colonial days there. And all of my ancestors lived there. But I went away.
You came out here yourself when?
Well, in 1924.
Doing what? That's it.
I came as a professor of biochemistry and pharmacology.
Here at the...
Opened those two departments here in this school, which was, well, what would we call it? A little provincial. It wasn't developed very well. The School of Medicine.
What, was it out here on 13th Street?
No, not then when I came. They had, well, they'd built a brand new building at the University of Norman, a small one, for the first 2-year courses. And then they had a building at Stiles and Walnut, I think. No, Walnut. Well, it's near down in there in that section. I forget the address, about 3rd or 4th Street. And that's where they had their outpatient clinics. They did have the beginnings of the University Hospital over here. This all was out here. And it was at that time a pretty small building.
Then when did you move out here?
4 years later, in 1928.
You've seen a lot happen here, not only in civic and governmental progress, and the city itself, but also in, since you deal in medicine, you've seen a lot happen in medicine, haven't you?
That's right. And then I toured the state a lot. For the last 17 years, I've visited many towns, because we have preceptors out there for our 4th-year medical students. And they're changing all the time. I guess there must have been 100 different towns that I visited, and this was wonderful to get a first-hand observation of all sections of the state, almost like a salesman or something, you know.
Right.
So I was very interested in Oklahoma history, and indeed the history of the whole Southwest, really. And it was wonderful to see Oklahoma grow.
Who were some of your contemporaries?
You mean
in the early days?
You mean non-medical or?
Either. Makes no difference. Someone who has had some connection with the city? The
Well, of
growth?
course, in the School of Medicine, a very well-known man was Dr. Leroy Long, who was dean of the school for about 16 years. And he was in that Constitutional Convention
Right.
with Governor Murray and others, later Governor Murray.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew him well, their family. And actually what I knew mainly were the older physicians.
Mm-hmm.
You see, when medicine started, may I just say a word about that?
I wish you would.
I mean, when medicine started here in Oklahoma City years ago, you know, in the very early 1900s or thereabouts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what was it, 1889? When
1889.
Well, then in the 90s and the early 1900s. Why, the physicians had come to the city, of course, to practice, and later they organized a medical school, these pioneer physicians, really. And they organized a private medical school under the Epworth University, at that time, now Oklahoma City University.
Right.
And they organized the Epworth University School of Medicine. Those were in days when medical education was not highly developed. Indeed, it was in many of the schools. There were several hundred medical schools at that time. They were really proprietary schools. They weren't universities or colleges, and you can imagine the variation in quality.
Yes.
And along about, I think it was 1908, a study was made of this nationwide, and it was decided that they had to raise the standards of these schools, so they closed all but maybe 100 of them subsequently in the next 2 years. And this was one of the schools that closed. They closed voluntarily, most of them, because they just couldn't meet the requirements of a real university-type education. And so the old Epworth became the University of Oklahoma School of Medicine about 1910, about 2 years after this.
Oh, yeah.
This national recommendation. And so the men who were teachers in the old Epworth Medical School, it was my pleasure to know a fair number of those, in fact all but a very few. And then so they were really the pioneers. And
Who were some of those men?
oh, well, when Alice and I moved to Oklahoma City in 1928 from Norman, we happened to buy a house, and in it had been living Dr. Hatchett, and he was one of these pioneers in obstetrics, and he later, now practically all of these old professors transferred over to the faculty of the university, you see. He was one of them. Another one was Dr. Arthur B. Chase. Another one, of course, was Dr. Todd, who died years ago. He was an ear, nose, and throat man. There was Dr. Blesh, who was a surgeon, and so on. It would take me too long, I think, to enumerate them, but there were, well, perhaps 18 or 20 or so such men. And I really knew most of them. Oh, there was Dr. Archie Kelly West, who was the father of Dr. West, who died recently and had been a professor for many years. His father was a professor in the old Epworth and later here. So it was a pleasure to know these people. And then, you see, I could watch, well, at least 3 generations in Madison here, and it was wonderful to see the development of all this, you know.
It's been quite a transition, hasn't there?
Oh, yes, very interesting, because you see, here we had a beginning state almost, so to speak. At least certainly a beginning as far as medicine is concerned, and to see it develop up to where it's really found its stride with other states in a short time, whereas, of course, the northern and eastern states has had 100 to 200 years, you know.
Well, they had put pretty much of a running start on.
Yes. Of course, one of the things I always liked about Oklahoma people, I don't just like the climate. My wife and I were delighted with the people, because all the artificiality of the East and of European countries and the North was not present here, and the people were either pioneers or children of pioneers, you know, the active groups of people then, and well, they just rolled up their sleeves and worked. You know, they weren't, they didn't wait to have 62 meetings to debate over something.
Well, there was too much to accomplish.
That's right, yes. So this spirit always fascinated me. And while the people, by and large, you see, for instance, in their language, in their English and so on, were not usually the polished kind of person. They were the Western pioneer type of person, but underneath it, the finest kind of character. And it was a great pleasure to have medical students like that who didn't mind calling you most anything if they thought they should. I don't mean impolitely, but
No.
and yet they were eager and just as fine students as you'd find anywhere.
I was going to ask you about that, their approach to and also the end result.
Oh, well, you see, there have been some very wonderful physicians and scientists leave this part of the university. And they're scattered all over the world, really, and in the military services. For instance, one of the young men, almost speak of boys, I don't mean it that way, who this year was made a general in the Air Force. He had served the Air Force ever since he left school here in 35 or 36 or something like that, and there aren't many medical generals in the Air Force. Maybe 8 of the United States Air Force. And this is quite an accomplishment. He's a wonderful man, but they're scattered all around.
Who is he? Who is that?
That's General Freitas Duff. D-U-F-F, Duff.
Is he from where?
He was head of his class here, for example.
Is he from Oklahoma City?
Let's see. He's an Oklahoman. I'm trying to think whether he came from Edmond or some town near here. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly, but not from the city itself. Oh no, there have been very fine graduates. It would take too long to try to recall a lot of them.
Yes, the many that you've seen go through the schools and so forth.
Well, yes, I did a little teaching for 4 years in Harvard Medical School too before I came here, but all in all, counting that and this, I haven't added up the students, but it would come pretty close to 3,000 medical students that I've had an opportunity to work with, something like that.
Have you always felt this drive, this progressive spirit that seems to be?
Yes, I loved it and I understood it because, what I felt was, in contrast to the East where my family had lived and I had lived as a young boy, a young man, I felt that the real America had transferred to this place and to the adjoining states and in the Rocky Mountain area. I didn't include the West Coast in my thoughts because it got, pretty highly developed. But in this area between the Mississippi and including the Rocky Mountains, what I felt here was the old America in the spirit of the people. I mean, they did a lot of things for themselves. They didn't depend on, they couldn't depend on too much government aid. They had some, of course. And so I don't know. And then again, there's less of a dilution with the many foreign immigrants of recent years, that is to say, the last 20, 30 years or something like that. So I really think it's probably an example of the old America. I mean, the old standard and good America. I don't speak of it in the sense of being ancient, which it isn't. So, and when you read colonial history, which, the history of the colonies in the East, which my wife and I do a fair amount of, we enjoy it, and which incidentally doesn't appear in education very much, in my opinion. I don't mean just public schools, but colleges. One is astounded by the difficulties those people faced and had to face and did face, Well, this in a sense then would seem to us, at least, as a pioneer state where similar things were going on, and there's only a certain type of people will do that,
And there are only certain people who will work.
Yes, and who are willing to go to undeveloped areas and, shall I say, help develop them through their lives and their work, But it's fun.
With all the work, it certainly must have been rewarding for you in the beginning days.
Well, yes, oh yes, or of course we probably wouldn't have stayed if it hadn't been, but we never felt disappointed. We thought this was the people always interested me. There's some very fine people of all kinds of professions and work in life that have come out of this Southwest, and especially Texas and Oklahoma. Of course, some from New Mexico and so on.
what your sphere of operation and activity has been here in the city and in the state, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. Well, as far as medical work's
Yes,
concerned,
as
yes.
far as medical is concerned.
Although my wife and I took the opportunity in the earlier years here to travel widely in the Southwest and in the West, up into Canada even. And in the way that people had to take their vacations or even their business in those days, because while it isn't very ancient, well, nonetheless, I remember in the 20s, 24 on, the paving stopped out here at Watts Lake Overholser, and I remember the first trip we took west, there was no more paving of any kind. Even, I don't believe there was any in Denver. If there was, it was very little, until we got to Pasadena, for example. So, and the roads were not roads. I mean, there were no highway maps, there were no highway numbers, there were no paving, many of them were just ruts.
You just pointed west and followed your nose.
But there were the old trail signs, and at considerable distances, you know, Pikes Peak, Ocean to Ocean Highway, and things like that. But you see, everybody camped. That was another thing. I remember Amarillo at that time was a tiny town, and I don't know, maybe 5,000 people. No tall buildings of any kind, and mainly a lot of wooden cabins on the prairie. And you couldn't, well, there wasn't really much place to stay overnight. There were some little wooden hotels, a very small thing. So you just camped out, and everybody did. And all the towns, as you may recall, had their camping grounds.
Right.
Here too, of course. So this was wonderful because everybody camped there, from the banker down to the janitor. And it was a lot of fun, you know.
Well, in talking with many of the people around the city, which is our purpose in this living library for the college, it's amazing from, and it shouldn't be, but actually when you get into it in the initial stages, amazing to see the number of people who have started from nothing here. Absolutely nothing, and
practically all.
yes,
Most all.
and through their hard work, their diligence, their intelligence, their dedication, they brought themselves forward, and at the same time, they have devoted a great portion of their time to activities that would be for the benefit of the whole, not necessarily themselves.
Oh yes, indeed, I agree with that.
There any number of them, as we say, contemporaries.
Well, it was very common, wasn't it, for that to happen?
Isn't that true?
Yeah, it is. And this is what I meant a little about the old America when I spoke.
I don't think that they've lost that, do you, Doctor?
No, I don't think so. But of course, the nation's become urbanized, as we all know, more or less. And so then when people get crowded in the bigger cities, there are different factors at play, you know.
However, we do enjoy the advantage of being expansive, this city does.
Oh, yes. Oh, my, yes. Oh, as cities go, the southwestern cities, too, are full of pep, you know. Yes, it's a, what would you say, a prolongation of that spirit.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Under a modern setting.
Well, yes, we must recognize the modern setting, but at the same time, we have felt, and I know I personally have felt, just that that feeling still permeates,
Oh,
and I don't
yes.
think it's been minimized by
Positively.
progress.
Oh, positively.
As a matter of fact, in some of the generation that has followed on, they have been imbued with that also.
Oh, yes. It's nice to see leaders arising out of each generation. It's wonderful.
We're not only dealing with your reflections and so forth in the general overall picture of what Oklahoma City was like, and as you say, there was hardly any paving, and it was rather rugged, wasn't it?
Well, yes, but somehow people didn't mind it. They didn't have a vision of the modern expressways or something like that, you know.
They knew something was going to happen. How about the rough times? Were there rough times in the medical profession and in the school, particularly here?
Well, of course, you remember that in the 30s, it was rough for everybody.
Yes.
But aside from that, rather severe depression, financial depression. Everything accomplished was with a struggle. But indeed, I doubt that very much good is accomplished without a struggle of any kind. It takes work to construct something or to develop something, it always takes a lot of work. So to that extent, let's say it's a long battle to develop things. You don't do it in a short interval.
Although in the modern idiom, the complex here is perhaps adequate.
You mean the medical center?
The medical center.
Well, it's become more adequate, and it's going to enlarge and become more modern again, you know.
Well, that's a continuing process, isn't it, Doctor?
Yeah, well, there's no comparison between the medical center today and any period you want to name before, any decade that you want to name. Well, you know, in a university, I mean a state university, one owned by the state, progress isn't a straight curve going on all the time, you know, because there are periods when money's had to be raised in various things, so it's more like a series of plateaus, you know. In other words, advances are made at intervals. Of course, it's true of anything, probably.
Well, that's true also. In your experience, discounting even today's activities and the prospect of more advancement, what do you think was the most critical area in your experience here in medicine?
You mean now or years ago?
Oh, in earlier years, not necessarily now. We'll get to the present in a few moments.
You mean about medical education?
That's right, medical education.
Well, goodness, the critical problems just changed all the time with the years. I would say one of the most critical things of all that permeated all the decades, which would now be about 5 decades, were always finances. I mean, to get adequate finances. That's really a continued critical problem. And if I had to name one that was a keystone to other problems, that was the main one.
I suppose you could say that would be basic, because...
Oh, yes, it is basic. Yeah. It is basic. And it's basic under all kinds of varying situations. Doesn't make a difference what the immediate problem is, because it all requires financing.
Even in the more affluent years, it's still a basic problem.
Well, the trouble is, you see, now here in the medical center, we really achieved, the center achieved fairly fine national status in the last 15 years. And it hadn't been. The medical center was, well, frankly, on probation with the national authorities in medical education. And it was a long struggle because, well, for instance, we didn't have nearly as many salaried professors as was demanded, and didn't have facilities and didn't have buildings. But now it's a well-recognized medical center. And so it has changed.
Well, roughly what would you say is the status at the present time here in 1965? And that's the beginning of 65.
Well, I think the situation's excellent. I mean, here we have been recognized as a very fine school, not just an ordinary one, but a fine school. And we have a good faculty, which has increased almost adequately, not quite, but a great step forward. And then the big thing was to get some modern buildings, which the people of the state voted bond issue for, you know, and which is in process. So when this is effected, you see, well, I would say, and this might take 4 or 5 years, of course, you see, till you really have something. I think when that's completed, that we can say it's in excellent shape. Of course, it is a good teaching institution now, but handicap. I mean, it will lose good professors and so on if we don't give them facilities.
Physical handicaps and so forth, right?
Well, you have to have, you know, a university hospital is the biggest laboratory for a medical center. Laboratory in the sense that that's where the medical students learn how to deal with patients and what to do. And in other words, they have to learn practically. There's no need of just
That's
reading books.
on-the-job training.
Yeah. So you have to have really good facilities to train new generations of physicians, because whatever you do is not for the day and hour, but for 30 years ahead or something like that. So you ought to have a real fine institution. I mean, capable of doing most anything that should be done, in regard to instruments and,
Right.
facilities, and it ought to be humane too for the patients in the sense that there shouldn't be any more crowding or physical difficulties for a patient than in a good private hospital. And of course our hospitals are old, and physically you can't really now they're kept nicely in that, but it's really a mess for
Well, the older type buildings, hospitals included.
yeah, that would be true of anything, you see,
Didn't,
any hospital.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or an office building is.
But you see, the point is that these young men should be brought up with the finest of training. That's the point, because there can't be too good training for a physician, because he has people's lives
That's right.
in his care, and he must be trained for years ahead.
What is our complement today? I doubt if you can, or if you want to make a comparison with any other place, but do we have an adequate complement of professors? I mean, numerically.
Well, pretty nearly. Although the difficulty is that those that we have are we have had financed by means other than the state, and this is a continual struggle. Some millions of dollars had to be raised here each year, aside from any state money. And this is quite a job, and I don't mean just 1 or 2 millions. And then trying to get these funds is an eternal business, so to speak.
Would that, although it shouldn't, but it possibly does have a psychological effect on attracting other professors here?
Well, I had it wasn't a theory, it was an observation that the most important thing in a professor, but it goes for other lines of work, is a person's spirit when you appoint him. And this is something to look for, because of course he should be trained to do his work, whatever it is, and you would not take anyone else. But amongst those, the matter of spirit in a man is everything. And a man who has spirit will come and work, not only in his own technical work, but he'll work for an institution. He'll be part of a community and part of a city. And indeed, some of our professors have, as you know, have helped a good deal in civic life, like Dr. Wolf with the symphony and so on and so on, So the main thing is get people's spirit. Well, we've got them. We have a wonderful faculty. Of course, the thing to do is make it possible to retain such people, because they get fabulous offers,
I should imagine.
Oh yeah, of course. So it's competitive, but I figured right along that the spirit was the thing, because then there are many hands to help, you see, and they're needed. So we do have a marvelous faculty from that viewpoint, far superior probably to most any you could find in another medical school. I'm not sure that we're the only one, but they're not too many. And as regard to their ability and training, they're finely trained and very able. So we have a real good faculty. Didn't quite big enough, but the main point is really that it isn't financing. It's financing itself, which is a little odd thing to find in educational institutions, that the faculty has to finance itself.
This is quite a
And
trouble.
I don't mean by fees from patients, which are very small. I mean, not in that sort of work. That's the practitioner's work, but that's hardly anything. And so the professors here had to raise a lot of money.
Do you see any answer to that in the future?
Oh yes, there'll be answers, but you get into what's going to happen to government and to people. And this we don't know in a democratic place, a democracy. It's in the end the expression of the will of the people, if it remains a democracy. And I just don't know what all will happen, except I'm sure there'll be a solution to these things. The reason is that, after all, medicine and religion and law and we could name some other things, engineering, are really essential to the people. If they weren't essential to the people,
That's an essential to existing.
well, they deal with some of their dearest possessions,
That's right.
the law and religion, medicine especially. But Of course, that's why they were named the three old professions in ancient times, even. It wasn't because other people didn't have as much training, in a college or university sense. It was because, after all, what they did represented matters that were terribly important personally to the people. And so they elevated these to what's known as professions, that is, the old professions. So,
How about the student body?
well, I've always considered it an adequate student body. Most of our student body are Oklahoma boys. Well, not all of them, but most. We maintain it that way purposely. Because it isn't, to the extent the state contributes, you see, why, it should, Oklahoma boys should, who are qualified, should be given
Well, your standards,
preference.
Your standards are very high, despite whether they're from Oklahoma or not, aren't they? There's requirements, rather.
Well, the requirements for entrance into medical schools are pretty generally the same. Oh, there are a few medical schools back east that try to pretend that they're some kind of super medical school, which of course they aren't. But, well, they're good schools, and they may have higher education requirements, but this is no advantage. The education requirements are adequate, I think, and they're practically standard over the country.
What about the morale of the student body?
Oh, that's been fine. Through the years that I've been here. Let's see, this is my 41st year here. With the university. So, actually, I'd say that there never was any kind of a student morale problem. Anything serious.
Oh, sure.
No, I can't remember one. And our student body, they've been pretty gentlemanly, and they've been more mature than in colleges. Of course, they're that much older, for one thing. They're either graduates of colleges or at least have had 3 years of college, preparation. So they're a little older. They're not quite as childish. And it's a competitive situation. They know they have to work, but they get along well. And one thing that delighted me was when they themselves adopted an honors system of student government here some years back. And I recall at the time there were some doubts in certain professors' mind whether we could turn over the giving of examinations to the students themselves, But we did that, and we actually had fewer student problems. Individual ones, ethics or anything like that. After that, and so I would say it's been a fine student body, wouldn't you? The proof is right in a thing like that.
That's right.
Now, of course, there are occasionally some problems, as there would be. There are with ministers, there are with policemen, or with anybody.
They're dealing in human beings.
Yes, there are occasionally people who...
the overall.
It's been excellent, in my opinion. Very fine.
Well, we value your opinion. After all, you've been rather close to it for these many years.
Well, I should say it's one of the things I've enjoyed, that the student body was good. Really.
Well, there always has seemed to be a rather obvious camaraderie between within the student body and the professors and so forth, the whole area of this medical training here.
Well, the medical training in one way is a little different from most anything else in a university, a little different, in that you not only have to educate a man technically, and with many technical things, and with many sciences, but you also have to develop his ethics and his morals. And rather, he has to develop them, because of course no one else can. But there's a challenge in medicine for the student. He just can't be some kind of a cheater of some kind, even just in his own mind. And this happens because he sees in his last half of his medical school training, because he's working entirely with patients then, he sees these enormous problems, the sadness, the deaths, the significance of medicine, and this does a lot in the development of good ethics.
He either does it then or he doesn't do it, right?
Well, the average graduate of medical school, or I'd rather say the great bulk of all but maybe a very few percent, really are and remain fine men, as students and as practitioners. But there's some accidents. of course, in a faculty, any man who is found, any student who hasn't gained a proper moral concept just isn't graduated until he does. But you see, life has some curious patterns for anybody, and so after they graduate, once in a while, physicians like anybody else can fall a victim to drunkenness or drugs, but not many. And the interesting thing is, this is hard to predict. You can't detect it because they don't do that while they're here. I mean, life does things to some people and to anybody. I mean, you know. Well, that is very hard to ever eradicate in any school, because the life is yet to be lived, you see. And but actually, there's so few of such physicians that the result is magnificent, I think.
I'm so happy you brought that out, because I think there are many, many people, and there'll be many students as they reach back and listen to this discussion in the years to come, and they use this for a workshop or to try and settle an argument, you might say, to put it on that basis, that there's a great deal more to a medical school than just the technical aspect.
Well, you see, the patients are a big factor, which you don't have in other forms of education. I mean, the very fact you deal with these things. I'll never forget one woman physician. She became a woman physician who, when she entered the hospital work, this was years ago, entered the hospital work in the third year of the School of Medicine. She'd just been there 2 weeks maybe, and she'd been seeing a lot of patients, and they were seriously ill patients. And a patient came in who had very little of his back left. It was just one huge and tremendous ulcer. I think it was a diabetic patient, which hadn't been cared for at all, you see, out somewhere in the state. And she was nauseated over the thing. I mean, she took care of the patient, but she came running to my office. I wasn't dean then, and I knew her, and she told me she just couldn't stand seeing this terrible thing, and I hopped right on her. I said, now listen, you know why you're having this reaction? I said, here's a very sick and hopeless man, and you're supposed to be his doctor. And here you come running over to me that you can't stand. I said, now, the only reason you feel this way is you're thinking of yourself, and you should think of the patient always. And she dried her tears, and she went back. She became a good physician, but it shows you the impact that a patient has on a medical student. Oh, various kinds, all kinds of impact. So this helps develop their character.
It could really make or break them, can't it? In the end, if it's really that bad.
Well, of course, a girl would be sensitive.
Well, I mean, man or girl. A man
yeah, but a girl especially, you know. But she became a fine physician.
Has there been an increase in women in the medical
schools? Oh, no,
schools?
that fluctuates. You can't draw any curves. They don't mean anything. Some years there are a few more, some years a few less. Because the entrance of students is all competitive. I mean, so if there are more girls that are better prepared and seem quite suited, why then there are more taken in. But there's no limitation.
No.
I mean.
But I was
so there are
wondering.
varying numbers. Some years there may be just 2 or 3 entering in the class of 100 or so, and then some years there may be as many as 10. You see, not too frequently 10. It isn't too easy for a woman in medical school because, of course, there's still, you know, the student spirit of kidding and teasing, and but still, it's a very wonderful thing for a woman to go through medical school because she can remain a perfectly fine lady and gain considerable skill, and it just builds her up, really, you know. So. We have had some wonderful women. I can remember a number personally, just wonderful, excellent physicians.
Well, there are any number, not only around here, but also around the country.
Of course, they had to be hard workers, you know, do a lot of work.
I suspect that a woman really has to work harder than a man.
Well, I don't know what she does, because she can be just as bright, you know, but the point is, as I say, she has to live in a sort of male atmosphere. You know, they do a lot of kidding.
Oh, surely.
And I wouldn't want to stop that. Heavens, but it's friendly kidding, you know.
Yeah. Well, you can't completely eliminate the human element, because in the end,
the
end result, you're dealing with humans anyway.
Well, actually, the male medical student a good sport is just really kidding her to see if she can take this or that, you know. And
Yeah.
if she can, his hat's off to her. You see, that's all it is. Yeah, but it is a little more difficult for them. Of course, maybe not as much now as in years gone by, because there were more places for women in medicine. All kinds of work they can do when they graduate.
Is it really the age of, or now the evolution into the practice of specialization? There are many more specialists as we
Oh,
noticed.
yes, that's an interesting thing that's been bandied around, you know,
Yes.
in newspapers, magazines.
What's your opinion from your experience and a doctor's point of view?
Well, actually, no, if we can be real frank, I would not have discussed this subject to be recorded if I were still dean of the School of Medicine, because I wouldn't want. But I'll speak as myself, as
Right.
I said. I'm very friendly to general practice and also to specialization. When people argue about this, especially physicians or anybody else, when they argue about it, it just isn't a subject for argument. I mean, it isn't that we could have so many votes this way and that way. That doesn't mean a thing. The reason specialization has arisen, and it rose gradually and has grown all the time, is that there's so much more knowledge available, scientific knowledge, which a physician must know and use, and must have skill in the use of many instruments compared with years ago, and has to learn all this. So it's gotten so that it would take endless years of study to be this good in everything. In fact, you'd be an old man, then you wouldn't be a physician. I mean, a practicing physician. You couldn't do anything much. So it's been the result of increased knowledge in medicine, which has grown by leaps and bounds, mountainous strides. So this has led to specialization. And now how far that'll go on, I have no idea. But in other words, when a young doctor specializes after he leaves medical school, he doesn't do that in medical school. And that's why when people try to talk about the medical school turning out too many specialists, they just never turn out any specialists. See, that's a lot of baloney. They don't realize it, but that's what it is. But the decision is made by the young graduates themselves. But the reason they do this is not to be mean, not to not become a general practitioner in a small town. Indeed, a good number of them do this and want to do this. But those who specialize do it because they feel they must know more. I mean, they are conscientious.
And they have perhaps a bent toward that particular field.
Oh, yes, of course. It attracts them.
The same as someone is either a football
But
player,
you
a
see, the
baseball
joke
player,
of
or a
all that
lawyer.
argument, I mean, there's so many. No, I couldn't discuss this publicly because when I was head of this medical school, because I would be misinterpreted and it would be the school talking.
Right.
They would say, perhaps. But the fact is, you see, that a specialist can still practice in a small town. And he's also a general practitioner, because he's had all the training of the general practitioner. And so the problem of the final destination of these physicians is not the problem of a school of medicine or anything you can ever do about it. Not much, anyway. It's a choice in the mind of the man who's left the university. And this is his own decision, based upon what I said a minute ago,
Right.
but also based upon economic factors and many things, family, endless things. It would be just like, in your case, you might take a position of a different kind if it really appealed to you, and if you felt it was an improvement or for you personally. So these are things that, but the specialist can be in a small town too, and indeed, then it brings excellent medicine to the town. Well, small town, I mean reasonably sized town. So I don't know. I could sit here and theorize what's going to happen in the future. I think I know, but I better not say it because I'm not sure.
Well, by dint of necessity, Doctor, there has to be specialists in practically any line of
Well, the
endeavor.
point is, it's almost futile to argue about
Right.
specialization now.
Perhaps most of the arguments...
Not that I'm in favor of it as versus general practice at all,
No.
but the point is it's futile to argue about for the reasons I mentioned.
there has to be some of all, right?
Well, and there will be, but not adequate. I mean, not adequate numbers, perhaps. Eh? Of course, there's another angle that must be considered, and this I learned through these many, many trips to the preceptorships in the towns. when we first opened the preceptorships.
How does a preceptorship function?
Well, these are
Just
faculty
roughly.
members who are good practicing physicians, fine ones, out in the towns, not in Tulsa or Oklahoma City.
Smaller areas.
Well, anything but these two big cities. And sometimes in very small towns. Well, maybe on the average a town might be about 4,000 or something. Well, anyway, the first time I went out there, when we opened the preceptorships, I had the idea, see, that the practice out there was an awful lot of going out to farm homes, you know, of the physician locally. Well, I found out it had almost vanished even then, which might have been 15 years ago. And I visited them to see, and actually the patients were coming in because the old Saddlebags doctor, the real pioneer physician in the countryside, he did do a lot of that, and he did ride a horse for some few years, and later drive some old Ford or something. And he did go out some, but not only he was able to get a Ford, also the patients. And they got to where it was much quicker to drive in town to see the doctor, because if they wanted the doctor to come out, he was seeing patients, it'd be a while till he'd get out there, see. So, well, even like places, I went out to the Panhandle, I remember, on one of those trips the first year, and heck, probably all the patients were coming into the doctor's office. So, I mean, things have changed for the people, too.
They have changed.
A 30-mile trip in a car is considered nothing if a patient's at all transportable. The family's happy to take the patient. And there are no facilities in a farmhouse to do much, you know. So medicine changed, and the people changed, and transportation changed, and so on and so on. So now, physicians located in towns which have a little territory around them, this is all right. And that's the way it is, really, and has been for some years, practically so.
I should judge then, on that basis, they would have, your preceptors, so to speak, would have a great opportunity to encourage young people.
Now, some people, you know, in the arguments human beings put up, thought maybe we did this to get some practical training for the student. That is not so. We sent him out there for him to see what the problems of the physician are with the community and with the patients. A closer tie-in, because in a university hospital the patients are all referred. Most of them don't live here. They come in, they're alone, they're in an institution. This is different from the problems that they'll come to see a doctor about when they just live across town, you know, in a little town. So we figured he would see here the actual situation about practice being not connected with an institution. Also, it was a wonderful time for the physician there, or physicians, to show him all the various impacts of medicine on people and people on medicine. I mean, there's nothing like going to a laboratory instead of reading a book. And we figured that this would add to the young man's knowledge of how to practice medicine. Not foolishly and not ridiculously, even though he did things right, but also with some satisfaction to his patients, aside from medical treatment. So I think this is important in the success of a practitioner. Because even when he practices in a big city, he still has somewhat similar problems about the patients having confidence in him and liking him and feeling he has an interest in them and the community, you know. Not too much different in a sense from the way they want to regard a minister, in a little different sense.
Well, even in a larger city.
Yeah.
Your larger city is really made up of a great many neighborhoods or smaller towns that...
And indeed, where are people more lonesome than in a large city? Some of them.
Correct.
Because there isn't all that little neighborly mixing, you know. Can't be. So the preceptorships, I think, have been a fine way to amplify the knowledge of our students concerning relations with patients and with the community. And this is excellent, as long as you have good men. And of course, we're very careful in choosing a preceptor physicians. And we never let any kind of pressure change any ideas. Just none at all.
Just
It was the man out there. We select him as we would any inline faculty member. When he's interested in teaching and his ability to do so. Of course, teaching this angle of things. So I think it was wonderful. I mean, a lot of, if I could voice a general, I don't want to call it criticism, but a general doubt about modern education, university type, in all its array of things, that the theoretical is the great thing in the university, but not the use of that in the life to come, in many things. And you see in medicine, the last half of the medical education is spent on just that in various ways, taking care of the patient. Now, there's an awful lot of book reading stuff goes with it for the student, but he's actually applying his knowledge.
It's a practical application.
And under very close observation and criticism and help. And so this angle of medical education fascinated me. You could do it in anything. You could do it in any form of education. And those of us who had to hire people, and of course like in the industries, they get a boy from college, they hire him on a certain basis, but they figure many a time he doesn't know anything about their business or what he better do in it, which is pretty good precaution. And so they have to train him in that, so to speak. Maybe it's a long process. Maybe they gradually advance him, you know. But if they knew that he already could handle the problems they want, really handle them, I mean, practically, quickly, he would be
facilitate matters.
It sure would, and they would be more assured of having somebody that could really do it, not just know how to do it, but could do it. So this, I think, is a wonderful aspect of any kind of education. Because...
do you see it creeping in other professions?
Oh, yeah, but at an awfully slow rate. Well, you see, I'm a graduate engineer. I mean, I was first of all an engineer, and I worked in some industries back east, and I saw this sort of thing going on. But there really, in those days, wasn't any industrial training for an engineer. You just came in and worked. But I've often thought that engineering could do this beautifully with industries, you know.
Oh, yes.
But of course, I don't mean the trade school type of stuff, because that's, well, I mean, if you want to develop a person of responsibility and real knowledge, he's got to be supervised. He can't just spend 3 months, say, in some publishing company if he's a journalism student and think he got some education. Oh no, there had to be faculty appointments. And just like we rotate our students in the preceptorship. See, they all have to go, but we have enough places that no physician has to take more than 5 students a year on 2-month periods. And so they get individual attention. One man, one student.
Well, obviously the reaction to the student has been very good.
Now I think you could apply that in art or religion or anything. Well, this sounds critical. I don't mean it that way. I just mean that I feel that the pattern of medical education has been a wonderful thing. Of course, medicine was driven to it. Not that they were superior men devising education, but they had to. After all, life was at stake, see?
That's right.
You just couldn't have fumbling. Not with any patient. So I guess that's what drove them to it. But it's interesting to me because I think it's a very fine kind of education. Because if you know theoretically everything that could reasonably be expected about something you're going to do and can't do it, and are so fumbling about it that you undo all you're trying to do through some factors you hadn't thought about, either in the behavior of people or economic conditions or competition in industry or something like that,
Right.
then you're just useless. Doesn't make a difference how theoretically trained you are. I mean, you can't bring it to the people. Excuse me, I've rated too much. But
No, you haven't.
the thing is, it was this angle that fascinated me. Now, of course, most any university student can get this on his own, you understand. He can go and get trained by proper selection of positions or appointments and learn and and get good, but it isn't a university deal, you know what I mean?
Well, too often, perhaps, in other areas of education, the student is too much in a hurry.
Yes.
It takes time to do
Mm-hmm.
that. It takes time. It takes a great deal of dedication, obviously.
Yeah, you see the time it takes in medicine, enormous amount of time. Really, medical education is a long thing. Because, first of all, he has usually 4 years of college education, sometimes 3. And then he has 4 years of medical school. Then he has an internship. Then he has a residency, those that go on specialize. And when you add all this up, you pretty soon got yourself 12 years after high school. And then he goes on studying, depending how skillful he wants to be, he goes on studying for years and years. He's now, of course, at work, though. But it's a long thing.
Well, I would say it's never ending, actually.
It shouldn't be, except, of course, when people get real old, you can't. I mean, physically they no longer can quit, but it never really should be. And, of course, this is true in any work or business, really, too, though, isn't it?
That's right. You're right.
That those that succeed really work hard, and they're learning many more things than they knew last year.
Well, too often we don't use that brain as much as we should.
Well, no, and I suppose that the bulk of a population, you wouldn't necessarily want to fasten all this on them, because they have a right to live and enjoy work and enjoy life, and not necessarily be forever preparing himself, because, but actually I'm speaking now on people. After all, university people are not just all the people, because it's a limited fraction of the people that go to university, and supposedly all of it should come the great leaders, and many times that's so, but every now and then there's some self-made man who becomes a great leader, and maybe even today hasn't gone to college. But he didn't do it by sitting. He gained all this knowledge. He worked day and night, but not in the university.
Well, it's a rarity anymore, though.
I don't know. I just don't know enough about it. But of course, let's say it's difficult that way, because you had to be not only the student but your own teacher, which is hard for them to visualize. Well, I've gotten to preaching too much here. Let's get back to something that you.
I think it's extremely interesting. I think it's a valuable part of our collection that we will have, because it's expressions like that that mean so much, and sometimes we don't realize what effect it may have just on one individual, which will prove its point and also be of help.
Yeah.
No matter what area they're studying in.
Well, in some general ways.
That's right. Now, how about the physical aspects in the future here for the medical center, which is extremely important?
Well, probably it'll stay right here at the medical center for a while.
But at least there is the expansion.
Well, there's pretty good investment in here now, you see. Then there's the urban renewal business going on, and since the city decided to have one of their projects here, I think that should help it. And then, of course, some funds have been voted by the people, and there'll be others. But I don't know just what form this will take. I mean, just where buildings will be built, or.
But at least we're not standing still.
Oh no! Well, you can't stand still. The American people aren't standing still, not about to. I don't believe. Never seen them stand still in my lifetime. Oh no! Well, in fact, when you stop to think about it, the only constant thing about living people is change. The minute they don't change, they're dead too. I mean, change in various ways. And so change is a real thing, and to be expected, and not to be made a subject of cranky comment. Because it'll go on anyway, and it just shows that people do a lot of thinking and insist on some changes or bring them about one way or another.
Well, it's pretty obvious you're not discouraged about anything.
Well, I think it's so wonderful to be associated with young people. It's a great opportunity because they keep you realizing it. Maybe you're getting old, and maybe better not get old, as long as you can.
You don't want to admit it, right?
Well, I think
no
there's
one does.
stimulus. And another thing, you see, the young people of the world are the world to come. You and I won't be, especially I don't know your age, but we won't be. Our day will be over. And they are the world to come. So, well, they're the hope of everything. They'll be the hope of something not so good sometimes, but they're the hope of all that's good, too, you know.
Right.
And so this youth business to me is fascinating, you see. It's wonderful. And I couldn't imagine myself, I may get there, but I couldn't imagine myself sitting in some colony of old people, even though physically handicapped, and being surrounded by old people. Not that I dislike old people, but these young keep this world moving.
Well, they do a lot for everyone around them, don't they?
Well, yeah, they keep us from getting ossified. Really. We, of course, hand something over to them, or should, parents and such, because they must receive some kind of guidance, because, maybe I shouldn't say this, but we're born just about like animals, and our knowledge is nil. And we develop all that, and guidance is needed in the early stages of a young person, but not later, and they develop into, while still young, they develop into pretty smart people. A teenager isn't really a dull person, you know, mentally. Pretty alert. So this fascinates me.
Doctor, you lead an interesting life.
Well, I think we all can if we like what we're doing and take an interest in it. And I read an article years ago by some, I don't know who it was, some journal or something, that when you got to be 65, who was successful? What was necessary to be called successful? Well, the little net summary was that you should still be interested in things. You should have just enough money that you didn't need a bag but could live retired, but not luxuriously. And you should be happy. And if you had these things, you were a success. And that only 1 in 20 people was a success by those standards, which are minimal enough. Now, this was an article, but there was a lot of truth in it. Well, if you're going to be happy, if you're going to be interested when you're older, those who can be, those who don't have some mental disease, and there are a lot that don't, you have to have interests, and they have to be real interests. And you better cultivate a second one beside your work, just in case you couldn't do your work. And to do this, one must start this years before you retire. For instance, I'm really fascinated with some things that have nothing to do with medicine, like the anthropology and history of old races, history of religion. I'm really interested in reading these things at times. And I don't mean just casually, but building up knowledge. You see. Well, you ought to have more than one string to your bow when you get old. You don't need to have it when you're young. And it's, a person can educate themselves so wonderfully this way, if they just want to. My wife told me the other day she was on jury duty, and there was a sweet little lady on the jury, and she went out to lunch, and what my wife does is run over to the library down there, see? Because the library is fascinating. There's a lot of things that people never look at. And so this lady said, well, let's go get lunch. And my wife said, well, I won't need this whole hour and a half for lunch. I'm going to the library for an hour. And the little lady perked up and said, to the library? Well, I'll go with you, But you see, the point is that you darn near had to be doing those things. And then she was very interested in the library. Found out some things she wanted to read. She happened to live out in a little tiny farm at the edge of the city. Probably a little hard to get to a library, but a very lovely lady, my wife said. But just hadn't been thinking about the library.
Well, she's probably had her interest stimulated now. She may do better then.
Oh, I don't know. That's just a little
But those little things sometimes have a fantastic effect upon people.
But there's so much one can learn by themselves, in spite of all professors and all universities.
Doctor, we've appreciated very much your taking your time and your observations and the discussion.
Well, maybe I introduced into this the wrong sort of thing. I don't know. I didn't mean to.
No, I don't think so.